Well, that was hideous. 34-7, the final score, as the Houston Texans get absolutely annihilated by the Minnesota Vikings. Destroyed, dominated, use whatever synonym for those words you'd like to use. It was a putrid performance, one of the worst performances from a DeMeco Ryans team in his tenure as the head coach. They played one of the worst first quarters in the history of the franchise. It was a bad performance. 4 big takeaways on how it all went wrong in Minnesota. Let's start with the lack of resiliency for this Texans team. When things went bad, they weren't able to pull themselves up. We saw that a lot in the first week of the season against the Indianapolis Colts. Small things didn't turn into big things. Small things turned into avalanches of suck for this team this week. It was awful to watch this Texans team go out there and have constant moments where they shot themselves in the foot. And they weren't using a small caliber firearm. They were using a bazooka. Okay, that's the old idiom. Shot themselves in the foot, mistake after mistake after mistake. The Texans constantly made them to keep themselves from getting into position, and they couldn't overcome those mistakes. CJ Stroud, even as good as he has been at different times, couldn't overcome those mistakes. And there was just so many things wrong with this team, offensively and defensively, that the team couldn't overcome. It felt like as they started to nosedive, they just couldn't pull out of it. The defense had a moment there. They allowed the first 2 scores, and then they went on a stretch where they forced the Vikings to punt. But Minnesota came out at halftime and was able to march the ball down the field to make it 21-0. That's not resiliency. You're supposed to come out of halftime with a renewed sense of opportunity in the game. Instead, Minnesota, and they get a little lucky on that drive. A fumble goes for a positive gain of 7 yards. It's a ticky-tacky, really crappy pass interference call that sets them up for the score. But ultimately, you're supposed to come out and show that you have that resiliency out of halftime when you could have made some of those adjustments. Instead, the Texans get kicked in the teeth right out of halftime. It goes up to 21-0. And at that point, they basically got to play a perfect game. They score. It's 21-7. And what do? They kick the damn kickoff out of bounds. I mean, come on. There were so many small things that turned into big things for this Texans team that typically, I feel like, don't end up as huge things for this team. But the resiliency that they showcased early on in the season, it wasn't there for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into. The second being this offensive line played terrible. It was horrific. Laramie Tunsil had one of the worst games I've ever seen a supposed best left tackle in football play. He came into this game with 4 penalties, okay? He came into this game with 4 penalties on the season, 4 false starts. He left this game with 9 penalties. He left this game with 9 penalties. He even had one of them declined, and they came at inopportune times. Laramie Tunsil false starts on first down on a run play. The Texans are in 1st and 15. That changes the way you operate things. That's when the Texans go to throw the football, and it gets intercepted. Laramie Tunsil wiped away a couple of plays with his depth being too deep in the way that he lined up. That can't happen. One time I get it, but to have it happen a second time in the game from one of the most expensive tackles in all of football, one of the most expensive players that's not a quarterback in the entirety of football, that cannot happen. This guy is talking about he's excited about being the top paid left tackle a couple of times in his career. He's taken notes in the offseason when people say he's not one of the best left tackles. Play like it. Stop making penalties. Stop having false starts. Go when the ball's supposed to be snapped. And I know you can say, oh, well, some of those, maybe it's on the center. Okay, well, lining up correctly is not on the center. That's on Laramie Tunsil. And oh, by the way, the performance when he's not creating a penalty, it's bad. He played poorly. Juice Scruggs had a bad game. Shaq Mason, for the 3rd week in a row, just had an Olay play where a defender just ran right past him to sack CJ Stroud. I don't know how that happens 3 weeks in a row. Titus Howard played poorly. This offensive line was not supposed to have massive issues pass blocking. They have massive, potentially uncorrectable issues in the pass blocking. And In run blocking, they weren't much better. Cam Akers had a 9-yard carry at one point. He was able to gain 12 yards on the other 8 carries. Joe Mixon, if he had played, there was nowhere to go. The Vikings were ready to attack this offensive line, and they just got after them, and they were eating their lunch all day long. Stroud couldn't get anything going in the passing game because if it wasn't a penalty, it was a pressure. He was running for his life a couple of different times. This was a horrid performance from this offensive line. It is too expensive. You've got one of the most expensive left tackles in football, one of the most expensive right tackles in football, a top-paid guard, a first-round pick, and a second-round pick as your starters on this offensive line. That is a tremendous amount of investment in the offensive line. It cannot look like this on a consistent basis. They've had a slight moment of success where they ran block or they were run blocking well against the Indianapolis Colts, and that was week 1. And since then, this offensive line has not played well. It's got to get better. The Texans either have to scheme it up better or have to give those guys some help, or they have to seriously look into making some sort of change somewhere along that offensive line. If this type of performance continues, you cannot win. You cannot win when you are taking such massive losses in the trenches. That brings me to my next point. The best defensive line and the best pass rusher didn't play for the Houston Texans today. He played for the Minnesota Vikings. Jonathan Grenard was all over the place. He absolutely dominated Cade Stover a couple times. One, Stover had a holding penalty, which kept him from murdering C.J. Stroud, which was probably a good move by Stover. But again, to have Stover one-on-one with Grenard later and have him just get bowled over by Jonathan Grenard, that was unacceptable by the Texans. The Vikings were able to get pressure with their defensive line. They were able to unleash Jonathan Grenard. The Texans finished without enough hurries and without enough pressures on Sam Darnold to make a difference. They got 4 sacks. 2 of those came on the final drive of the half. One of them was a sack that caused a fumble. It led to a positive play for the Vikings. Now, that's not on the defensive line. That's just bad luck. But Will Anderson, Danielle Hunter, Mario Edwards, Foley Fatukasi, throw in Barnett in there. Heck, I know Tim Settle had a couple of the sacks, but it wasn't consistent enough on the defensive line. They did not own the line in this game like it felt like they did a week ago against the Chicago Bears. And look, the Bears have a worse offensive line and the Vikings have a little bit better offensive line. They got a really good tackle duo. You got to figure out some way to put pressure on Sam Darnold. And if DeMeco Ryans is going to just rely on those 4 guys on the defensive line to go out there and put pressure, they got to get home. You've got to heat up a guy like Sam Darnold. You saw it for small stretches in this game when Darnold has to make a quick decision. He cannot get it done effectively and efficiently when he has to make a quick decision and there is pressure on him. But there were so many times where there wasn't enough pressure or he avoided the pressure. He rolled out for Justin Jefferson on that score, the first score for Minnesota. The defensive line wasn't good enough. They didn't heat up Sam Darnold anywhere close to enough in this matchup. And that brings me to my final point. We'll find out a lot about this Texans coaching staff because this can be an anomaly or this can be a constant going forward. Teams are going to watch what happened in this game against Minnesota, and they are going to try to exploit those things going forward. The Texans coaching staff, let's start over on the offensive side. Bobby Slowick, you can't have your rookie tight end who's been playing the position less than 5 years go out there and try to solo block the best defensive lineman on the Minnesota Vikings. Run plays early on weren't going anywhere. And look, I understand some of the criticism to Slowick is going to be unfair because the 5 guys that are there to protect the quarterback didn't get things going. But again, it felt disjointed, some of the timing on some of the things. And look, Bobby Slowick, you've got one of the best young quarterbacks in football. You've got 3 really good wide receivers. One of them might even be great in Nico Collins. Stefon Diggs had a nice day. There's going to be criticism when this offense doesn't get going. You've got to figure out ways to overcome some of the issues that you're going to face. I understand you didn't have your number 1 or number 2 running back in this matchup, but you've got to figure out ways to make it work and make it click. You got to figure out ways to stymie pass rushes like what Minnesota was sending at CJ Stroud. And this game did nothing to dispel the myth that Brian Flores has the Shanahan trees number. He called a pretty good game. His players had a great game. And Bobby Slowick and the offense, there's a lot more questions to this offense than there are answers at this moment in time for this Texans offense. And then from a DeMeco Ryans' perspective, didn't heat up Sam Darnold enough. Even if you've got to take a risk with some of your coverage, you got to get in there and you've got to make sure that Sam Darnold doesn't have time to just sit back, relax, and cut you up and cut you to pieces like he did in this matchup. Some of the ways that they covered Justin Jefferson was pretty curious. If Derek Stingley's a potential all-pro player, like I've said before, okay, then let him have an opportunity to man up on Justin Jefferson and try to beat him, try to win one-on-one. Don't give him this big cushion on 3rd and long. Jefferson twice in this game. It was like 3rd and 7. He ran 8 yards, ran out, caught the first down, chains moved. He ran 9 yards, or he ran 10 yards on 3rd and 9, caught the ball, chains moved. Like, let Derek Stingley get in there and try to make something happen against Justin Jefferson. I didn't like the off coverage on Jefferson. You let the backup wide receiver who's playing instead of Jordan Addison, he beats you up. The rushing attack for the Vikings was okay. They stacked it up late, and it looked a little bit better overall than it actually was. But Sam Darnold can't go in and have a big day against you like this. Sam Darnold can't go in and have 4 touchdowns against your defense. There's not a lot of swapping and moving out. It's not like the Texans had an excuse on defense. They had the guys that they wanted and needed for this matchup. Hell, the Vikings had way more excuses. They were missing their 1st-round pick, who's an edge rusher, and they were missing their 2nd leading tackler at linebacker. And they looked like they had no problems with a loaded offense that has a lot of wide receiver talent and a really good quarterback, and they were able to just attack the Texans. The Texans, when they were on defense, weren't able to do the same thing. Those are the 4 big takeaways with a little bit of extra sprinkled in there. Resiliency, non-existent. Offensive line, non-existent. Pass rush, non-existent. Coaching advantage, not today. And the Texans get dominated, destroyed, annihilated. Again, whichever synonym you want to use. We'll hit the power thesaurus for this one to have some more synonyms as we talk about this matchup throughout the course of the next couple of days. Not a fun one to watch, and not a fun one for those guys, and definitely not going to be a fun one if you let one like this turn into 2 or 3. The Texans got to pull up real quick to make sure that a loss to the Vikings doesn't turn into multiple losses because they're licking their wounds and can't figure out what went wrong in this matchup. What'd you make of this game? Let me know in the comment section down below. On your way down there, throw me a thumbs up on the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't miss SNL 8 a.m. Reaction Monday morning, tomorrow morning. You don't want to miss it. Myself, Landry Locker from the Locker Room. It's going to be a good one. 2 hours. We'll break down everything about this game. And my goodness, is there a lot of bad to break down. We'll get to it in that one. Appreciate you watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. I can't wait until we talk Texans again soon. Hopefully we're talking about a win next time, or at least a much better performance.